Good evening. You are listening to Right on Campus, the UW-Eau Claire College Republican podcast. Good evening. You're listening to Right on Campus, the UW-Eau Claire College Republicans podcast. As always, I'm Ryan, the Vice Chair of UWEC College Republicans, and I'm joined by my co-host and working partner, Tatiana, the Chair of UWEC College Republicans. We have a great episode for you tonight. Tonight, we'll be discussing the Ukraine war and its recent developments, as well as the meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky at the White House. With that being said, let's get into the story. So I first wanted to start by doing a little bit of a conflict recap because this Russia-Ukraine war is very cryptic and it's difficult for people to understand if you're just kind of jumping into the issue. So there's a lot of historical context that we could go over, but honestly, it takes too long because this is a very richly historic region of the world, and they have a lot of different land claims in that area. But without getting into it too much, basically after the Second World War, there was a dual polar world. The Americans dominated the Western Hemisphere and were in allegiance with the Western European nations, and the Soviet Union controlled the Eastern Bloc as well as some of the Eastern European countries. But over the years, that receded. Ukraine was one of those Eastern European countries that the Soviet Union formerly controlled. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet-occupied states of Eastern Europe became independent. So over the years following the demise of the Soviet Union, there were some of these countries started electing pro-Western presidents, and Ukraine was one of the last ones to fall. And so Ukraine was having this debate over if they ought to be more Russia-aligned or more Western United States-aligned. And they had a pro-Russian state government, kind of quasi-Russia, pre-2014. And so that's where this war kind of starts, is in 2014, a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was negotiating an association agreement between the European Union and with Ukraine. So he was debating on if he wanted to be more pro-Western or more pro-Russian. Yanukovych abruptly abandons the deal and then chose to be more in line with Russia. So that's kind of where this all comes in, is in 2014, the Ukrainians started to aligning themselves more with the Russians. Well, and that didn't sit well with the EU and the Americans. And so pro-Western Ukrainians were empowered to take to the streets and create mass protests, which are formerly known as the Euromaidan protests. So they were demanding Yanukovych's resignation. The protests ended up turning violent, and then the government was forced to crack down on those protests. This is where you get a lot of the controversy of the U.S. involvement in Eastern Europe at that time. So there were U.S. diplomatic officials, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland under the Obama administration actively supported the protesters, and controversially, Victoria Nuland was caught in a leaked call discussing who should lead Ukraine after Yanukovych's removal, which implicates, a changing of the guard, or a what do they call that? The formal term, regime change. So the U.S. started imposing sanctions on Ukrainian officials responsible for the violence against the protesters. They stood up very aggressively with the protesters, and there was a main U.S. political NGO named the National Endowment for Democracy, which there's a lot of conspiracy over, the CIA and the FBI's involvement with them, and that's where you get all these, I guess I'll put them in air quotes here, but you get these theories or conspiracy theories about U.S. and CIA involvement in the Euromaidan revolution of 2014. Okay, so with that out of the way, Russia's response to these protests and to this, this pro-Western shift was to push into Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic Ukrainian territory named Crimea, which is this Crimean Peninsula off of the southeast of Ukraine, which is Ukraine's port access. You know, it enters the Black Sea. So they don't formally invade. They send in these like paramilitary. You know, if you've heard of the Wagner Group, it wasn't the Wagner Group. They named them the Little Green Men, and they went into Ukraine, and they were basically Russian soldiers without Russian military uniforms. So they're fighting in Ukraine. Obama is struggling to deal with it. So the U.S. and EU then impose sanctions, and that kind of is this war of attrition. It's just a civil. They call it a civil war inside of Ukraine. Russia, pro-Russian separatists. So these are Ukrainian citizens. They create a separatist movement, and they start rebelling against the Ukrainian national government in Donbass region of Ukraine. Two of the main provinces were Donetsk and Luhansk. They declared independence from Ukraine, which is, heightening of this pro-Russia in the eastern side of Ukraine. Okay, so there's all this fighting, and then Obama actually leaves office, his term limited out, and Trump gets in. And so this is where you hear all these talking points about how Putin didn't do anything when Trump was in office, which is actually true. What is a lesser known fact is Trump did then increase military aid to Ukraine during his term. It was kind of quiet. There wasn't as much shaking up of the battle lines, and Russia wasn't formally involved. And so Trump kind of was doing this peace through strength foreign policy, and we kind of stayed out of it for almost 4 years. Finally, we get to the semi-present day. So as we all remember, in February of 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of eastern Ukraine. Yep. This is where they started rolling the tanks in and then having targeted airstrikes on military industry and supply lines and logistics and all that. And it was this whole shakeup, and the whole world condemned it, right? We all remember. But the U.S. then immediately provided $75 billion of lethal aid funding. So this is HIMARS, rocket systems, Patriot air defense systems, tanks and drones, Javelin missiles, and other munitions to the Ukrainian front line. The United States also offered intelligence support in the initial phases of the invasion in 2022 with drones to Ukraine. And then the main thing here is the Western world put aggressive sanctions on Russia. So they totally cut off the market, freeze the assets that were overseas. They withdrew all diplomatic ties. They pulled visas from Russian politicians so they can't come to the embassies in America and in Western Europe. And so that's kind of where we're at. So there was the stalemate, and there was fighting for a very long time. But over these last 3 years, the appetite for the Ukraine war has shifted domestically in the United States of America. We started out having about 75 depending on how conservative you want to be, maybe 60% support for Ukraine. There was pretty much overwhelming support. Everybody in the country was so shocked by this, and there was a lot of support, right? Well, over these last few years, Trump's base specifically, but the Republican Party has really shifted from their support just fully to Ukraine. And that's where we're going to get into the very recent developments. So Trump wins the election, as we all know, and now this attitude against Russian aggression has shifted, and we're looking for more of a diplomatic take. So with all that preamble out of the way, a few weeks ago, Trump requested a meeting with some of the heads of state only between the United States and with Russia. Right. They wanted to hold it in a third-party country, and the third-party country they chose was Saudi Arabia. So I have an AP article here. In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, quote, Russia and the United States agreed on Tuesday to start working towards ending the war in Ukraine and improving their diplomatic and economic ties. The two countries' top diplomats, which is Lukashenko and Rubio, so Secretary of State, and then I think it's their foreign minister or something, and they have a different name for it. The two countries' top diplomats said after talks that reflected an extraordinary about-face in the U.S. foreign policy under President Donald Trump. In an interview with the Associated Press after meeting, After the meeting, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the two sides agreed broadly to pursue three goals. One, to restore staffing at their respective embassies in Washington and Moscow. These are the people who had been banned at the beginning of the war. To create a high-level team to support Ukraine peace talks and explore closer relations, and then economic cooperation. So that happened a few weeks ago. The significance of this is obviously Zelensky was not invited.
And there's a lot of talk about that.
Right. And so Zelensky gets cut out of these negotiations, and the message Trump is sending there, or the administration is sending there, is that, hey, we pay for this war. We're financing this thing. This has been your fight, but more our burden for the last 3 years. And it's kind of sending the message that, listen, we make the rules here. This war is only allowed to be fought so far as we fund it.
Right.
And so I think that's a great strategy from Trump. How do you feel about that?
No, I mean, I agree. I think this whole thing, we'll get into even more how it relates to this later on, but this whole thing reminds me of like a parent and two siblings fighting.
Yeah.
And like if you are fighting with your sibling, your parent isn't just kind of a screaming match with you and your sibling forever. They're gonna know. They're gonna go talk with one sibling, then go talk with the next. You can't expect to be invited to everything in a negotiation because it's just everything's gonna be a fight then.
Yeah.
And like you said, we're funding this, so we are gonna be at all the negotiations, and we're gonna be sure that both sides understand what we need from them.
Yeah.
So that we can help them reach that peace.
Yeah, that it sounds. I don't know how much you watch Tucker, but that's kind of
no, I don't actually.
Really, that's something Tucker says a lot. Is like, the United States is really the dad,
right?
That has to come in and separate the two children. So, but I guess in this analogy, it is more Ukraine is the child because Russia is prosecuting the war and has the ability to do it, and we have the ability to back them up. So it is more a more prudent analogy might be that the adults are talking, like the adults are talking, Ukraine probably take a back seat. So to set the scene for this whole debacle at the White House, Zelensky's cut out of these negotiations. And then Trump and Zelensky have a little spat on Twitter.
Right.
Where Zelensky's pissed about not being in the meeting, and Trump shoots back on Twitter saying, typical Trump stuff.
Yeah.
Then we have a UN General Assembly meeting. And this was a big deal. We actually had this come up at our meeting, which even was very surprising to me. So the UN General Assembly has another motion, they do this all the time, to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The U.S., in this very surprising move, actually voted with Russia. So they didn't formally condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine and was one of only a few countries to do so. So they voted alongside Sudan, Iran, and Russia and the United States. All voted together.
Not what I would expect.
Yeah, not typical. So following this, Trump has a meeting with the G7 countries. And these are people like Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom, Emmanuel Macron in France, and some of these other G7 leaders. Trump floats this idea that the United States need to be paid back for what happened.
Right.
And one way that we would be able to do that is to have mineral rights in Ukraine, to gain these mineral rights and these natural gas rights, to make some money back there. Zelensky then requests this meeting with Trump. So then he comes to the White House, and here we are. Stage is set.
And I do think it's important to note, too, he requested this meeting.
Yeah.
And
he wasn't invited. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it all starts at the very beginning. So Zelensky arrives at the White House and gets out of the car. And what's the first thing Trump says? So Trump goes up to him, and Trump goes, "Look at what the guy's wearing. Thanks for dressing up today. Look at him." And then he says it to Zelensky, and then he turns to the media, and he's like, "Look, he dressed up for me today." And the joke is he didn't.
No.
He's wearing the typical,
it's like a sweater or something.
And they've got that like emblem, the Ukrainian emblem on it. And, he's been doing this for a long time. And at the beginning, it seemed like it was okay. He's fighting a war. It kind of seems like endearing, or he's putting on the costume or whatever. But to continue...
Right. And these are the people that are funding you.
Yeah.
You requested this meeting. You're taking up their time.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, is, I know I was talking to some of our members earlier, and they were like wondering if it was like a cultural difference or maybe he just didn't like suits. But it's not like if
No.
you look up videos of him, he's in a suit all the time.
Yeah.
It's not
No. He's a statesman. I mean, this is their
Right.
job. They know that that's the uniform, and
Right.
he's just overdone the. Because there is something too, like when JD Vance is on getting photos and he's in the sweats or
Right.
the sweatshirt and the
Right.
jeans and he's coming out of the store like that. It can be endearing, but it's like you're at the Oval Office
Asking for money.
Asking for money. It's like you might as well put a coat and a tie on.
Right.
So that happens. They have this private meeting, and I guess reports say that it kind of got fiery at some points in private.
Did you watch it?
I'm talking about the private one.
Oh,
So they
okay,
had a
okay.
private meeting first with
Yes,
Trump
okay.
and Zelensky
Yes.
and Vance, and because Trump actually alludes to it in the main
That's right,
the main one,
yes.
and so then they have this press conference, which typically press conferences with other foreign heads of state are like 20 minutes long, and this press conference was 55 minutes long. So
Yeah.
they pull them out and they're kind of addressing the media, and it's chippy. Like they're throwing these insults the whole time, but it's regularly, it's mainly regular. It's
And
okay.
I personally felt like I know a lot of people
Yeah.
criticize Trump, but I felt like he held his composure pretty well.
He did all the
There
way to
was-
the end.
There
Yeah.
was a lot of
Yeah.
points where he could have thrown in some insults that
Certainly.
were pretty heavy.
Yeah.
And even somebody asked Zelensky why he didn't dress up, and Trump at one point even goes, "Oh no, it's no big deal."
Yeah, right.
And I think that's a very big, humble move on
Yeah.
Trump's part that we don't see a lot of the times.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And he kind of held his composure almost longer than he ought to have. Like, so
Yeah.
they're sitting there and it's cordial, and then how did it happen first? Because there's like three different spats where it gets aggressive. Like Zelensky takes a question and he kind of responds, and Vance steps up, and Vance, correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, and it's all starts when Trump begins talking about how destroyed Ukraine is.
Right.
And Zelensky is kind of like, no, you have to come visit. You need to come visit. And essentially saying that Trump only listens to propaganda from Russia and that he needs to come see for himself.
That's right. Yeah.
And so not only is he asking for money now and
Yeah.
military assistance
Yeah.
and all that, but now he wants Trump to come out there. And Trump is kind of like we haven't committed to anything yet, and Zelensky's pushing for troops, and he's like, we'll consider it.
Yeah.
And he does not give a definitive answer one way or the other, which smart thing to do in front of the media.
Mm-hmm.
And as he's doing this, Zelensky starts to shake his head, roll his
Yeah,
eyes.
he was really
And
getting
Trump
after
just
it.
ignores him,
Yeah.
which is not typical Trump.
He does.
And that's when JD and Zelensky kind of get into it, I think, from there.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I just remember JD Vance is sitting there, and it really took a turn for the worse for Zelensky's sake when Zelensky turned the line of questioning from the media to Vance.
Right.
And he turned and he asks
Well-
Vance that question where he's like, "Let me ask you, like, how do you, he said, we've made deals with Russia before, Minsk in
Right.
the 90s. We did it, again in the mid 2000s, and they don't listen. So how do you actually suppose that we keep the Russians from disobeying the deal?" And
Right.
and Vance claps back and he has something to say.
Well,
and
and if I remember right,
Yeah.
Zelensky straight up asks him, like, JD starts talking about diplomacy, and,
Yeah.
and Zelensky asks him, like, well, what kind of diplomacy are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, what is this? And,
Right.
brings up the Russia stuff. And JD Vance says, I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that will end the war in your country.
right. Yeah.
And, like just very straightforward. Like,
Yeah.
what kind of diplomacy do you think? Like, we don't want this war to keep going on. We're spending way too much money on it.
right.
And so Zelensky kind of then turns it into how America is going to get hurt and we're
Yeah.
not safe, and that's when Trump
Yeah,
steps up.
then Trump comes in. Yeah.
And he shuts that down right away. He's like, "No, you don't get to talk about how what's going to happen to America.
Yeah.
We'll be just fine."
You're not going to tell us how we're going to feel, because that is right. Zelensky's like, you're going to feel it. And that even almost came across as like a threat. Like he
That's
was
how
like
I intended
threatening
it.
us. Like
And that's why I think if you watch it, don't just listen to it, but watch it,
yeah,
you see Trump's body language change,
Mm-hmm.
and he actually kind of moves
he
closer.
shifts. Yeah,
And
classic Trump.
Yeah, and he's very smart with his body language,
Mm-hmm.
and he stops him right there and just talks over him. Zelensky keeps talking, he just talks over him
Mm-hmm.
because Trump has a very distinct voice that's very loud.
Yeah.
So if he talks, that's what you're gonna hear.
Yeah. No, yeah, and because at the beginning I actually watched the whole ordeal a few
Yeah.
times because the first time I watched it I was a little like, whoa, like that was really kind of crazy and Trump
Yeah.
was really going nuts. The more you watch it, the more you realize how belligerent Zelensky actually
Right.
was.
And when you understand the context of
Yeah.
what he was even doing there,
yes.
like, I mean, you're a sales major.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Would you ever go to somebody's house to sell them something?
Yeah.
And then
Demand
not,
things?
not
Yeah.
dress up
Yeah.
and then be
Real.
like, this is what we need, or you're gonna feel my pain.
Yeah, or you're gonna feel it. You know, you're really gonna. That's a great analogy, and it's just, it's so true. It's like Zelensky. The more you watch it back. It's like, I mean, he challenges Trump's guy. He challenges Vance first,
Right.
pushes back. Vance is clearly upset, and Trump says something in there that I alluded to previously, where he said he goes, these two don't like each other, and he points to Zelensky and Vance, which makes me think that they probably got into it in the
Yes.
private meeting, and Vance is really aggressively anti-Zelensky, at least, or anti-involvement in Ukraine, which led to that. But it was really something to watch Zelensky just lose it. I mean, I'm
Right.
sitting there, I'm like, why isn't he just shutting up? Just stop talking. Just
Right.
You clearly have now poked the bear. You've upset Trump and Vance, your hosts,
Well,
who you're asking for money for. Why
right.
don't you just stop
I
talking?
think he
Let it
thought
calm
that
down.
he could gain the favorability of the American people.
Right, or the media.
And
yeah.
and he may even be playing into the fact that Trump does tend to listen to the American people.
Yeah.
And that may have been his strategy there, but it doesn't work when at least half the country sees right through it.
Yeah.
You know, we
Totally.
see what the war is, what's happening over there. We see where that our money is not currently ending it.
Yeah.
So
Right. No, yeah, and that was my thought too, is just I can't believe that he let this blow up. I mean, because not to use the same metaphor, but he really played his cards wrong. I mean, like,
Yeah.
how do you go to your benefactor, I mean, he's the client state, so the benefactor state, how do you show up there at their doorstep and royally fumble it that way? Like, I
Right.
just don't understand why he was so, he just couldn't let it go, and he had Trump and him keep talking over each other, and then, and that's when Trump says, you don't hold the cards, you don't hold the cards here, and Zelensky then shoots back and goes, we're not playing cards.
right.
And that's just like, dude, you're such an ass. Like,
well,
what are
it's
you?
like what does that even mean?
Why would you
right?
say
Like,
that? Like, of course you know what that means. Like, why would it's such a smart
Right.
comment that it's just like, and then Trump blows up and he starts touching his arm. Do you see that? He's like touching his arm.
Yeah.
Classic Trump. And it's just, it's like, because think about what happens if you're Zelensky, which I think is masterful foreign policy by Trump. Trump knows the base doesn't want this war. He knows that the appetite is giving up by the hour, and we got to pull out. And Trump, quite frankly, has filled his administration with China hawks,
Yeah.
people who want to shift the focus over to the Pacific. And you can't do that while you're tied up in Eastern Europe. And so Zelensky...
Well, and there's another side of that
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
With part of the reason I think that Trump's not alienating Russia as much as people want him to be is if Russia's against it and China's against us, that's an entire continent against us.
That's a really astute take, actually, and I think we'll get into that.
And that's I listened to I think it was Jordan Peterson talks a lot
Yeah.
about that with Megyn Kelly.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting take that I hadn't heard before.
Well, and that's the thing is I totally agree with you, and I think that's where we can leave off with this Trump Zelensky stuff and shift a little bit more into what really happened here. Why is this happening? And I totally agree with you, and I think I really appreciate that you brought that up, because what people seem to forget is Russia is not the chief adversary anymore. It's not 1982.
No,
This isn't the
right.
Cold War. Like
And
Russia.
that's not us condoning their actions.
No, certainly not. But you have to have a sober take. If you recognize China is the chief foreign adversary, and we need to face them, you have to look at who are their friends, who are their quasi friends, who are their enemies. And Russia isn't actually best friends with China. They have land disputes. And one thing I was reading on Twitter too was, after these sanctions and embargoes went in place with Russia, the only countries they could do trade with were China and Iran. And so they did a ton of trade with China. Well, how is Russia going to get the goods into Russia? They're not going to just ship it by train through the Siberia. It goes by sea, and so there's two routes that the Chinese can take goods to Russia. One is through the Baltic Sea in the North Atlantic, which is dominated by NATO states now: Finland, Sweden, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark. You have to pass through the English Channel. The second way is the North Atlantic, the Arctic. Is the Chinese can send these icebreaker ships up through the Arctic Sea into Russia, and Russia doesn't want China to dominate the Arctic.
Right.
They don't have a they don't have a land border with the Arctic. They're not in the Arctic. The Arctic is dominated by the Americans and the Russians. And so China's invading that space, and Russia doesn't want them to. We shouldn't be alienating Russia. Which is what we should have done post Cold War, is invited Russia into the Western fold, made them a friend rather than an adversary. We don't need to be best pals, or whatever, but we don't need them as an enemy. We don't need to push them into China's arms. And so that to me seems like what this is like it's a total and utter humiliation of Zelensky, following his, disrespectful spat in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And I think it gives a lot of onus and good grace to the negotiation table with the Russians.
Well, and I think even beyond that, it sets a tone for the world that we're doing this.
Yeah.
And if we're going to be the ones funding this, then we're going to do it our way.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's interesting to see everyone freaks out when we start pulling money out of Ukraine, but at the same time says, we're not the only ones funding them.
Yeah.
But then why are you so freaked out when we pull out?
Yeah, exactly.
And so... And it's because the U.S. is the U.S.
Yeah.
We not only play a large role financially, but we set the tone for the world.
Yeah.
And people listen to us, and Trump is making sure that we get back to that state, so to speak, and that people see us that way. And going off of the stuff we're talking about with Russia, not alienating them as an enemy. I don't know if you saw, but just yesterday now, he imposed Russian sanctions.
He imposed more sanctions on Russia?
On Russia.
Really? Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And
I didn't see that.
It was either late last night or early this morning. And we're filming this on Friday for those listeners.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he essentially told him, you guys need to get to the table, or we're gonna start imposing more sanctions.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so it's not like he's just letting Russia do whatever.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the narrative right now.
It is. Yeah.
And that's not at all the case. And he even said in his Truth Social post that, Russia's absolutely, destroying Ukraine right now, and that it needs to stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I agree with. Yeah.
Right. I don't think anyone that's, anti-funding of the Ukraine war is saying that Russia should just keep invading Ukraine.
Yeah, right. And we're not pro-Russia. It's just we're pro not people dying, as Trump said in that debate, famously. So I think we got a few questions here we can talk over to kind of round off this podcast. Do you have one that you think you'd want to start with? We have a little bank of questions here we're looking at.
Yeah, so I got a few questions from some of our club members.
Great.
And one of the ones I find really interesting is, why is it that so many Americans support Ukraine and, are so passionate about this issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. Cold Warriors. I think we have, we just have an older population. A lot of boomers, a lot of Gen Xers, a lot of these, older people older than 30 or whatever, they kind of witnessed the Russian dominance. I guess older than 40, witnessed the Russian dominance. And so when they hear the media talk about Russia invading, they support stopping that,
Right.
But yeah, I mean, shifting to, it's like younger, it is more of an age thing. So if you were alive to witness the Soviet Union, you probably support American intervention. If you weren't, and you're younger and you lived through the debacle in the Middle East, you probably are just generally less inclined to support intervention.
Yeah. So I know that here on campus we have a lot of people who support Ukraine.
Yeah.
I know there was a protest downtown recently.
Yeah, the other day.
Yeah, and I know that there's an honors class all about Ukraine.
Really?
And the director of the honors program here is very, very pro-Ukraine. She even spent some time over in Ukraine a few years back. And I think part of it has to do with, I think we live in a generation now that's, thinks with their feelings.
Yeah.
And we can all agree that things that are that happen during war are atrocious.
Truly, yeah.
And it's terrible to see innocent lives ended. And I think, though, sometimes because of those feelings, we lose sight of reality, that doesn't mean that it's our responsibility to fix it.
Right. Yeah.
And we are working towards a peace deal. It's not like we're doing nothing and we're just turning a blind eye. But this isn't our war. And we can't fix every single problem.
Yeah.
That'd be like expecting, I feel terrible when, people are murdered.
Yeah.
But you can't expect me to go and stop and chase down every murderer.
Right. And it's negating the fact, too, that, like, life is cruel, and there's always been war, and unfortunately there's always going to be war, and it isn't, you're right, you hit the nail on the head. It's not, just because we are the dominant superpower, doesn't mean that we should be involving ourselves all over the place. And it calls me back to the founding fathers. You got to think about what they think. George Washington very famously wrote about staying out of messy foreign entanglements. And Hamilton and in the Fed Papers and Madison and they wrote about not wanting to get involved in these foreign wars. Now, historically, it's like, it was post-revolution, so they didn't want to. But at the same time, that was their feeling. And I feel like we should listen to their wisdom a little bit. And we don't need to just be everywhere all the time. That's not our role.
Absolutely agree.
So
then on the contrary, why should we care at all? Why are we even trying to negotiate a peace deal? Why not just leave it alone?
Well, that's a great follow-up question, and my answer would just be because we are the superpower, because we have the military might and the economic ability to use amazing powers like sanctions. We should look to use those before we were to use military. And I don't necessarily think that we should be completely isolationist and have nothing to do with anybody ever.
Oh no, absolutely.
But it's we should be. When we are backing this conflict and there's millions of people dying, it reflects on us.
Right.
And that's the same topic of conversation with the whole Gaza situation is like, it looks bad for us if we're funding it. And so there's this give and take there. That's my response. What would your response to that question be?
I think pretty similar. It's a balance.
Yeah.
You have to know how much you can do. Like you said, we're a very strong force, but there's also, we can't do everything. And so finding the balance of how much can we do. And ultimately, I think, too, a lot of people are looking to us right now. And, if we have the power to help bring these two countries to a peace deal, then we should at least try.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should just keep funding and funding and funding.
Right. Kind of a fun question. Somebody asked this one. So what's wrong with Zelensky's fashion choices? Why doesn't he wear a suit? What's your take on that?
I think he just doesn't care. I think he thinks he's telling Trump something.
Yeah.
Like he's like, I'll show you. But I think Trump, it's just funny to Trump. Like he's not gonna take you seriously.
Yeah.
Do you really expect to be taken seriously by a guy who will find any reason to not take you seriously?
Right.
And you're not looked at favorably right now by Trump, so why not at least dress up and make yourself more presentable?
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you on that. I think it's conscious. I'm with you too.
Oh, yeah.
It's totally intentional. I just think he's doing this.
It can't be conscious when you walk around on Capitol Hill or
the same way like Fetterman.
Yeah. No, right.
Like
if you're just in DC in general and you walk around, he's gonna be the odd one out.
Yeah. Right.
Like
no, absolutely. And I think I said this earlier, but I think he's trying to give this battle-hardened look, like he's here for now. He can only be here for 5 minutes because he's heading right back to the front lines. Like, that's not true.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's probably why he does it. Terrible decision. You ought not do that.
Right.
So.
No, exactly. And my mind just keeps going back to, like, in every single professional development class we've ever had.
Yeah.
One of the first things they tell you is you find something nice to wear. We even have a campus closet where you can go and get free professional clothing, which if you guys don't know, it's great.
It is really great.
And, like, just the fact that the leader of a country can't even do that.
Yeah, it's silly. It's because it's like people like to argue about, well, why do you have to wear a suit? It's like, well, okay. That's customary. It's just what you do.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to always wear a suit. You could do like the more casual look, but come on, man, you're going to the Oval Office.
Right.
Just put a coat and a tie on. That's all you got to do.
Not to mention, we've
like,
talked a lot about, like, at our meetings and stuff and with our debate nights, the psychology behind dressing up.
Absolutely.
And you come a lot of times, dressed up in your business attire, and it portrays this idea that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And
I like to think I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do.
Yeah, well, thanks.
You know enough to have a podcast.
Yeah, right.
But, in that confidence, we talked about this at our debate workshop too. If you portray confidence, people believe you and are more willing to listen to you. And Zelensky didn't do that. So I don't know why he expects to be taken seriously.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Kind of a difficult question, and it might get a little controversial, but why do you think Russia invaded Ukraine?
I think power hungry is really the simple answer there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think looking at just the size of Russia, it kind of reminds me of the size of Alexander the Great's kingdom, and gives off the same vibe where he just couldn't.
The Mongol Empire.
Right, like all those, that time period where it was conquering, and they just want more and more. And, I think Russia's kind of one of those countries that's just power hungry.
Yeah. I would certainly agree that it's about power. I would slightly disagree that I don't think that Putin is like a bloodthirsty maniac who now wants to push all the way to the Rhine.
Okay.
I don't think he wants to go after, through Poland, through Germany, into France. Like, he's not Hitlerian that way. But I would agree with you that it's certainly about power, and that as Russia has plateaued and then kind of come out of this depression post Soviet collapse, they are looking to expand their influence. And at least so far as some of these border states were like, I think why did Russia invade Ukraine? The Russian pretext for this invasion is that Ukraine, was cozying up to NATO.
Right.
And their excuse is we can't afford to have intercontinental ballistic missiles 250 miles from our capital. I mean, in the same way that if China put intercontinental ballistic missiles on Cuba, or like the Russians did in the 60s, you just can't tolerate that. It's just too close. It's not going to work. And so that's their excuse. Is that a righteous enough excuse to invade another country and kill a million people and almost 500,000 of your own, 500,000 of theirs? Absolutely not.
No.
So that's probably their reason for invading, but it's not a good one.
Well, and I also think, we talked about China earlier too.
Yeah.
And I think, kind of asserting their power could be another
right.
reason there.
Right. Yeah. To establish themselves as like a mid-rate or maybe a third, because we're leaving this unipolar hyperpower America dominant world, and that's the scary thing is like with the rise of China, like it's this dual polarity where there's China and America, but Russia is also establishing itself as a legitimate player, and and so that cuts back to why should we not be pushing Russia into China? You don't want to do that.
Right.
So, any final questions you have before we wrap it up here?
I guess just what's your outlook? Do you think Trump's actions are going to be favorable? Do you think we're going to actually get that peace deal soon?
Yeah, I do. I do. I do think it's not done. I think you're right with these sanctions too. I think Russia feels good. I think they feel like they're kind of in the driver's seat now, that we're telling Ukraine to piss off and we're going to do the talking. It's like Russia probably will feel like they have the ability to make demands, which they might, but Ukraine certainly is in trouble. I mean, Zelensky is quite frankly, he's either going to be thrown to the Russian war machine, or he's going to be eaten by his own people, or he's going to come to the table and say, "Please, America, fix my problem for me." You know, and so I think this will get dealt with relatively soon.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think honestly within the next month or so, we're going to start to see things start to unfold.
Yeah.
More towards a peace deal.
Yeah, withdrawing. Yeah, totally with you. With all that being said, thanks for listening to Right on Campus. We post this podcast weekly where we tackle current events and life as a conservative on campus. If you'd like to learn more about UW Eau Claire College Republicans, join our meetings on Monday nights in Centennial 1704 at 7 p.m. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at UWEC College Republicans, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or favorite and share this podcast if you're listening on Spotify. Have a great night. Thank you for listening to Right on Campus. We post this podcast once a week where we talk about current events and life as a conservative on campus. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at UWEC College Republicans. Have a great night and see you next time.